Aloha and welcome to the Here in Hawaii podcast, presented by Hawaii State Federal Credit Union. Today, we're going to be hanging out with the only historian who can keep my attention, Dr. Kealani Cook, Associate Professor of History at UH West Oʻahu.
I am an associate professor in history. I do Hawaiian history and Pacific history. So we're a small campus, so we get to kind of extend out a little bit more. So Hawaiian history, Pacific history, and one class on U.S. pop culture.
So growing up, were you always, did you always think that you would want to go into education and being a teacher?
No, I had no idea. I was like, there was like a string of movies in the 80s about lawyers.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I'm going to be a lawyer. And then I realized I'm not really good at arguing with people.
Are you you're too willing to say, okay, you're right?
No, I get confused too easily. So, like, if I have time to sit and think, I can think. But if I have to respond quickly, I'm going to get confused quickly.
Gotcha.
And then I was actually got my undergraduate degree as an engineer, and I was working as an engineer for a little bit, and I hated that. I saw my boss get really, really into designing a gate once.
Yeah.
And I was just like, I will never find that level of happiness and joy drawing a gate. And that was one of the moments where I was like, it's time to quit. And the thing that I was doing a lot on weekends and stuff was just going and reading history. So it was like, I need to do something that will get me that. And it is absolutely not being an engineer.
Yeah.
And designing gates.
So were you always into history? Was that something that you didn't realize that you could have a career?
Yeah. Like my grandpa was really into history. And then, I like stories. And history is just stories. It's just stories with a point to it. And I'd always been into history. And I just never thought the idea that could be a job was crazy. And even when I quit engineering, I was just thinking I'd come back, get a master's, go teach high school or something. And then it just was things opened up. I was able to get a PhD and then get a job. So that was we went up to Michigan to get our PhDs. My wife and I both got our PhDs in Michigan. And the idea was to just be able to come home and find something here. And we were lucky enough to do that.
What did your parents think about you leaving engineering to become a teacher?
They were not super stoked. It's funny, my dad though, he was like, he wanted to be a history teacher.
Oh, really?
What
did he end up becoming though?
A pipe fitter for the water supply.
Interesting.
It was he was a fisherman.
Yeah.
Then he was a powder monkey when they're doing the reef runway. So the powder monkeys are the guys who are in charge of getting the explosive done, and then there's someone who's in charge of the explosives. So they're the powder monkeys. So he was a powder monkey, then he worked construction, and then he ended up working for the county as a pipe fitter.
Wow.
Yeah, and he read my book. So
wow.
Yeah.
The parents are usually either your biggest supporter or biggest critic. What was his opinion?
They were it was hard to read. I gave him other books that people I know wrote, and he was like, "Oh, this was really nice."
Oh, sad.
That's brutal. But yeah, no, he the first chapter was hard, and then after that, it was like, oh yeah.
Do you think he actually read through? Maybe he stopped at
I have no idea. Yeah.
That might have been. So knowing that he wanted to be a history teacher, was there at least an understanding on his point of seeing your desire to do that and actually making that decision to do it?
Yeah. And same with my mom. My mom they were real supportive of it.
Oh, that's great.
Both of them did not expect the master's and PhD stuff to take so long. They're like, oh, you're going back to school for a few years.
Yeah.
And then it was like, oh, you've been back in school for a while. But I was lucky to get it paid for. So the master's and the PhD, I was able to get TA-ships and everything to work through. So I didn't have to ask them for money, because that would have changed it. Because then it's well, we don't have money.
Yeah.
So
what are you doing with your life?
So go back to engineering. Mm-hmm. But yeah, they were pretty supportive. My mom was telling people as a professor, even when I was a grad student, I'd be like, so that's a different thing? Mm-hmm. And I'm a grad student. I'm teaching a class in a college, but I'm still a student. So that's not the same as being a professor. And she's like, okay, my friends, I told them you're a professor.
Well, moms know best, right?
Yeah. And like now I am, so I'm like, okay, good. You're just a little bit ahead.
Yeah, she just was prepping them, right? Yeah. So what has history meant for you as far as, like, why was it something so important to you?
I don't know. It's like I said, a lot of it is stories, and like I always liked knowing stories. So it's the same thing with like TV, etc. Like I like plots, and so it's just plots and stories, and then it's the ability to make sense of stuff. Because you look around now and you see now, and you're just kind of like, well, this is how it always was. History lets you see like, oh, how did it end up like this? Which is sometimes a positive thing, where you like look at something that's like 8-hour days are great, and that's like, how did we end up with an 8-hour day norm? It's like, oh, okay, like people literally got shot in the streets protesting and pushing for unions, et cetera, in the 1890s and 1910s, et cetera. And now we have an 8-hour day. So it's just kind of seeing that, and then seeing things that are really messed up and seeing like, well, how did we assume they always happen?
Yeah. Like
we have assumptions that like racism has always been this way. But if you go and look at like specific, you're like, oh, this is how they made racism. So it helps unpack those things. It helps unpack it for me, it helps them, and then I can explain it to students, and then like really like seeing students figure stuff out where they're just like, oh, like that is why this exists.
Yeah.
I have a class right now on crime and corruption in 20th century Hawaii, and the students come in and they're just like, I thought we were just gonna talk about meth. I'm like, we're gonna talk about meth and the Kealoha case, and it's like, ooh, yeah, we're gonna talk about that, but first. And so you lay all that stuff out, and then they get to kind of unpack like, oh, why is the infrastructure bad on the outer islands when you're paying the same amount of like, it's like, oh, well, let's look at the long history of the outer islands being like neglected. Or, God, with the Kealoha case, it's just like, let's look at the long history of like, if you are in an appointed position in the state or the territory before it, like you have no oversight and you get to do whatever you want.
Do you ever feel like, because just even hearing you touch on these things, it's like more than just the students should know this? Like, do you ever feel frustrated, like everyone should know this if you're going to be in this society, right?
Like it should, like we should. Can I pitch a, like everybody should read this book?
Yeah.
Okay, where did I put it? This one and this one. So, Land and Power in Hawaii, which until like it covers up to like the 1980s, and it covers a lot of like the move towards a real estate based economy, and then just like how power is used to like, so like it even has a list in the front of all the politicians and which land deals they're involved in, and that's kind of nice. And then this one, Sunny Sky Shady Characters, which is James Dooley's, is a reporter for the Advertiser and the Bulletin. And it's just his old crime and corruption articles turned into a book. And it covers like everything from like Yakuza, Ronnie Ching, Frank Fossey, the airport, like the amount of just like dirty business at the airport.
Yeah.
So just throwing those in. It's great for like, it is great for students to know that. It's something everybody should know that. Like a lot of the stuff. Everybody, especially people who've been involved in business in Hawaii or, worked for the state, worked for the county, you see some of it. Everyone sees angles of it. When I was working as an engineer, I was working for the Air Force. You saw the corruption on that side. I worked for a contractor who should be unnamed and saw the corruption on his side. And everyone sees those little slices, but it's really nice seeing all of it together. And then you see like, you can get the overall picture of like, it's lack of oversight. It's all these different things that create this.
Yeah. When it comes to specifically like Hawaii history and culture, why was that something so important for you to not only really study, but to make this your career of educating, other generations about it?
So my grandpa had like a really solid library. Like one of the rooms in his house, like one whole wall was just bookshelves. And when I was a kid, I really liked reading the history stuff. And some of it was the big time life World War II stuff where it's like pictures of tanks. And like that was cool, but most of the stuff he had was Hawaiian history. And there was stuff in there that I really liked reading. He would tell me stuff, just stories. And like, that was something I really liked. I really was engaged in. There's a certain point in like 7th grade through 12th grade where, the curriculum has changed now, but it used to be, oh, Hawaii had some nice stuff. You messed up in like the 1880s and we had to take over, and then it's just like plantations, and then it was statehood. So there's this, and like the stuff we were using was based on early 19th century or early 20th century historians who were literally hired by the oligarchy to like come get a job at UH and write the story of how we became in charge of Hawaii. And it was very like, this had to happen because Hawaii couldn't exist on its own. And there was like, I separated from it. I didn't really do it, like read Hawaiian history for a long time. And it was when I started doing history again, I was researching stuff on sailors and pirates because it was 2000 and pirates were cool. And finding all the Hawaiian, like the people who were working on Hawaiian and Pacific history and hearing what they were doing and then running across it in the primary sources, and seeing a very, very different Hawaii than that little bit from high school that like just turned it off, shifted me back over. Wow. And then after that, it's been just kind of sort of connecting into that history and then reconnecting other students into that history.
How has this whole journey been as far as how is it related to you and your connection to your own culture and your Hawaiian culture? Like
a lot of my connection has come through the work because, I don't know, there's a certain amount of disconnect just in living on Oahu and just it's house, drop off kids, go to work. Like, so a lot of it comes through that. And like a lot of the connections I've made to people have been through the work. But also just getting more insight into it. Just seeing like, oh, like this is the shifts in culture from 1600 to 1800, from 1800 to 1850, and then 1850 to 1900 and 1900. So like seeing all the shifting, getting a better understanding rather than I think what I had before, which was sort of vibes on what my grandpa told me. So that's been, I don't know, for me, it's been really helpful having all that. Yeah. And then just seeing the young students that, like the grad students, the stuff the amount of work that is probably going to come out in the next like 10 or 15 years on Hawaiian history is going to reshape a lot of stuff. Like everything from people looking at, I mean, gender hasn't been fully sort of looked at, labor, et cetera, like all the way through, really reshaping stuff.
Did you always feel really connected to your Hawaiian culture side growing up?
No. I mean, it's like inside kid, watched a lot of A&E, which was all stand-up comics from New York and California.
You watched A&E?
Yeah, they used to have a lot of stand-up comics on A&E.
Really?
Yeah, it was Caroline's Comedy, I think, and Late Night at the Improv, something at the Improv. Huh. And there was just a whole stand-up comedian. So I don't think I was really connected. And yeah, I don't know, it was just like an inside kid. So it was harder. This is a way that I can be an inside kid and connected, but I was very much an inside kid.
Established in 1936, Hawaii State Federal Credit Union is one of Hawaii's largest credit unions with 14 locations across Maui and Oahu. They offer full-service financial solutions to meet your needs, everything from checking and savings to loans, credit cards, and more. And as a not-for-profit, Hawaii State Federal Credit Union is able to give back to their members in the form of better rates, lower fees, and innovative services. In fact, last year, they gave back nearly $19 million in share dividends to their members. And they also are strong believers in the power of building relationships and enriching lives, especially by giving back to the community. So whether it's through donation drives or by employees giving their time, the team at Hawaii State Federal Credit Union understands that small actions can have a big impact in the lives of others. So if you're looking for a place to bank that's always right by you, then you gotta look no further than Hawaii State Federal Credit Union. You can visit www.hawaiistatefcu.com or stop by any branch to join the HSFCU family today. Federally insured by NCUA. you're talking about some of the things as far as things that have happened in our history that has shaped where we're at now. So one of the things that we really kind of were excited to learn more about was, I didn't realize how much the plantation days and things that evolved from those communities have impacted what we see today. And so I was curious if you could kind of give us a little mini history lecture about the importance of the plantation days and the culture that, or do we call it the plantation society?
Plantation-era.
Yeah.
Yeah. Use all of those. People know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
No, I mean, if you think of the level of, when you ask a historian a question, you're going to get historical context. So up until 1850, most of the sugar plantations in Hawaii were really small. It's like an individual or a chief might have some sugar. Mm-hmm. There's a handful of Chinese sugar mill guys. And it's small mills, and it's basically like people will bring in sugarcane, process it there, and then they will take a cut. So like up in Manoa, et cetera, and it's using very similar methods to, I think it's like southern China. So that's like where all the Cantonese, that's where I think on my mom's side, that's where some of the Chinese came in with like that early period. 1850, they pass so 1850, two things happen around then. One is the mahele, where they create a structure that will allow for private property, but it'll also allow for government property that can be leased. And the other thing that happens is the Masters and Servants Act, which sets up an indentured servitude system. And it's called an apprenticeship program. And they sell it as like, this is the apprenticeship program that they use in Massachusetts, so you can train Hawaiians to be blacksmiths, et cetera, through this system. And what it also includes is allowances for agricultural indentured servitude. And those two things combined are what allows a lot of the plantation stuff to happen, because sugar requires a lot of land. So it requires really heavy, intensive labor. And the first efforts to do that, they tried to use Hawaiians, and the Hawaiians were like, we have options. Like, you want me to work 12-hour days in the cane, and it's hot, when I can go and fish and farm. I have options, I'm out. And then they started using some of the Chinese that were already here. They're like, okay, well, we'll get these guys under contract. And they had fewer legal protections, they had fewer protections in general. And then they started bringing like mass importation of people to work on the sugar plantations. So it's, that's what sets it up. The sugar planters seem to be really convinced they are unable to, it's all racism, but racism often has very there's specific elements of racism used at specific points. And when you see racism or racism, homophobia, sexism, you have to look at what is the benefit to the people who are doing this. Mm-hmm. And that defines how that racism is used and the elements of that racism. So the Hawaiians are like, the Hawaiians are lazy and they won't work for us. And it's like, you're not gonna go cut cane. Like, no one's lazy and they don't want to cut cane. If you don't want to cut cane, that's just called like normal. No one wants to do that. It's hard, crappy work. So they're like, well, the Chinese, they're like, and they dug into all like existing stereotypes of the Chinese. It's like, you are like mindless drone laborers and you're willing and happy to work like this. And it's like, people come in and they're like, I didn't have better options and I got tricked. When you told me I would get this pay, you didn't tell me that the cost of living was this high when you get here. So they're like, I'm stuck in a 7-year contract. And when they're done with the 7-year contract, they're like, I'm not a mindless drone. I'm gonna get off the plantation. I'm gonna go start a store. I'm gonna go like work in China. I'm gonna find something else because this is garbage. So then they turn to the Japanese and they're like, oh, the Chinese are bad workers. And it is like, what happened to 20 years ago when you're like, the Chinese are the perfect drones? They're like, no, the Japanese are the perfect drones. And so they brought in Japanese labor to keep, and part of it is because Chinese are leaving the plantation and the Chinese are getting too powerful. So they're like, oh, we're bringing the Japanese to weaken them. And then they do the same thing when the Japanese strike in 1908. They're like, we're bringing the Filipinos. So the Filipinos are good, docile laborers. And then when the Chinese, or the Filipinos and the Japanese strike, not together, separate unions, but they strike at the same time in 1920, then they're like, you know what we should do? We should bring in the Chinese because they're good, docile workers. And it's just, they keep doing it. And it's a specific racism where they're like, we want to create this vision because it justifies what we want. But the reality is nobody wants to work on the plantation. So all of those groups are being exploited on the plantations. When they leave the plantations, for the most part, after the Bennett Constitution 1887, anyone who is not already a citizen or born in Hawaii, if you're Asian, you can't naturalize into the late Kingdom era after this sort of coup where they put in a oligarchy constitution. And then during the Republic period and then during the territorial period, if you're Asian and you migrate to Hawaii, and especially after annexation, if you migrate anywhere to the US, you cannot become naturalized. The US laws were specific that only Caucasian immigrants can naturalize into a US citizen. So they're all being screwed on the plantation because the plantation, if you want to read about plantation labor, read Pauhana, and that book just lays out how awful the plantations were then. And when they leave the plantations, you're still being messed with. You're still being oppressed because you can't serve on a jury. You can't vote. Your legal rights exist, kind of, but who's going to enforce them? And you think about something like, if you can't serve on a jury, like how much power is in that, right? So that's like all of those things, and you can't own land. Their children can own land. So one of the things that starts happening is all those groups are being oppressed together, they're being played off of each other, they're paying the Filipinos at a lower rate than the Japanese, keep the Japanese in line, and keep the Filipinos in line at the same time, and keep all the rates low. So they're all being played against each other, but they're also all being oppressed down during this period, economically, politically, etc. And you start seeing that generation of kids are raised in that. Either raised on the plantation and knowing that like the bosses are always doing this stuff to us. When my parents tried to go out and strike in 1908, they called in the cops. In 1920, they killed 17 Filipinos that are out on strike on Kauai. And then they called it a Filipino riot. And so like there's all these things happening. So that generation is raised under this system. And if they leave the plantation, you're off the plantation, but you're still seeing it. And those kids are citizens. They're raised, and there is kind of an irony of being raised in a school system that is trying to Americanize you and be like, this is America, we have rights, but also your parents don't have rights and you only kind of have rights, but not really, because you're not this group of Americans. So that group is raised around that. They do know they have certain rights and they know each other. And that group, like they're pulling stuff from just like what had been plantation things into just broader life in Hawaii. So you start seeing all the restaurants in Hawaii not all, but a lot of the restaurants in Hawaii in 1910, there's a Maori, the Maori king is going to England to protest all the crappy stuff that they're doing in New Zealand. And they stop here and one of his guys comes in and sort of like spends the day driving around, I think with the mayor, Joe Fern. And his account is like, oh yeah, all the restaurants are Japanese. And it's like, okay, you got off the plantation. All the restaurants had been Chinese for a while, but you get off the plantation, first stop, restaurant business, right? And then from restaurant business, then you can so there's that sort of thing, and that starts shaping food. So like all of a sudden, it's why we eat saimin instead of it's all saimin instead of ramen because it came in 1900, not in 1990. So there's this, so there's all of that, like that's building up. You start seeing manapua, because it starts off as chasubao, but chasubao is like nice and small and dainty, and like it's open, and you can't stick chasubao in a bag and eat it. Like there's not going to be a chasubao guy walking around. You want it bigger and more substantial, and so you start seeing like manapua is Hawaiians not being able to say chasubao. Say mea ono pua'a, which is mea ono is like dessert, pig dessert, or like pig pig sweet, like pig bread kind of thing. And then the Chinese being like, Manapoa? So like everyone came there, they're like, yeah, we all know what Manapoa is. That's going to be the thing. So you have food coming around. You have even things like gambling, where it's just like the Japanese coming in and bringing Hanafura. So Hawaii ends up with its own Hanafura rules that develop in Hawaii. They're different from the Korean rules. They're different from the Japanese rules. And it's everyone knows like Hanafura is a Japanese game, but then by the time you get to like the 1950s, 1960s, everyone's playing Hanafura. So it's like everyone kind of remembers knows where the ethnic connection is. We know Manapoa is Chinese food, but also it's not something that the Chinese are the only ones who are eating. So it's becoming that sort of local culture, and a lot of it's coming from the groups that were on the plantations, and sometimes it's from things that happen on the plantation, the moving around of ideas in that generation being raised up on the plantations, but also the people who left the plantation and are in the city. They're in Hilo, they're in Honolulu, et cetera, and they're developing these new things, these new sort of ways of understanding who they are, what food is, like that kind of stuff. It's all emerging, and that generation is going to be the ones hitting adulthood in the late 1920s, but definitely in the 1930s, 1940s. Like that's going to be the people who end up going to World War II, the people who end up working in the war industry here, and they're going to be the people that are going to shape things from the 1940s until the 1970s and 80s. Some of them hang out, like Inouye is going to hang out until the 2000s. So it's really that group is going to shape politics in Hawaii. That generation is going to reshape a lot of the economics in Hawaii, and that generation is going to reshape a lot of the culture in Hawaii. And it's from that sort of experience of being in this world where there are ethnic tensions. Everyone is very aware of ethnicity, but there's also a growing sense of like it's us against them, and them is the big five, them is the bosses, them is like the Republican Party at that point, who had a 50-something year dominance over politics in Hawaii. And that sort of pressure and presence around each other is going to fuse into a new culture.
Hey, I want to tell you guys about one of the best companies to work for here in Hawaii. And I'm not just saying that. I literally had one of my good friends go down there and apply for a job. She got hired and she is just loving it over there. I'm talking about Elite Parking. I've gotten to know the owners and the management team, and they have one of the best work environments I've ever seen because they're good people down there. And they follow this philosophy of one team making a difference. And so they really take care of each other because they understand the value of everybody working together and being happy. I mean, it's the hospitality industry that they're in. And of course, they want to make sure that first and last impressions are always great. And so they really want to take care of their employees so that the employees can take care of their customers. So they do all kinds of things as it pertains to parking, like valet parking, private events, hospitals. They run the parking for commercial properties and hotels. So lots of opportunities, and they have other positions within the company as well. And so if you're looking for a place to check out for work, they're always looking for really good candidates. So I suggest that you go and check them out. Go to eliteparking.net/careers and see what they got. Maybe it might be a good fit. Here in Hawaii is grateful to be sponsored by UHA Health Insurance. For over 27 years, they've been committed to personalized service, working to provide Hawaii businesses with health plans that help support their employees' health and well-being while building connections through a caring heart. Now, they aren't the biggest health insurer or the oldest, but they're homegrown, they're founded by physicians, and driven by a profound kuleana and privileged duty to care for Hawaii's people. We hope that you enjoy connecting the dots to your why, featuring leaders inspired to malama or care deeply for our community while fulfilling their calling. UHA Health Insurance, your local insurer offering quality medical, drug, and vision plans to Hawaii employers. Join them at uhahealth.com/HIH. Is there a reason why, because you described sugarcane being so difficult and nobody wants to work it, what was there a reason why they felt Hawaii's the place to do that versus finding something maybe that everyone would rather do and use the land for?
It's because everyone wants it. There's always a market for sugar. And if there's a market, what Hawaii has is a good climate for it. Especially, and this is getting a little bit out of my range of expertise, but like part of it is we have wet sides and dry sides. So you can have the dry side out here in Waianae, or like Waianae and Kapolei, where you have tons of flat, hot days. And you can bring the water in from the wet side, irrigate that. So when you, like we have a really good climate for sugar.
Okay.
So like that's a lot of it. And there's just always a demand. I mean, think of how addicted, it is like the most addicted substance in the world is sugar. Like, so, and it is delicious. I love it. It's just horribly exploitative crop. Until, like in Hawaii, until they're able to get really secure unions and then mechanization, like it can't be grown in a way that, it couldn't be grown in a way that you can make millions of dollars. And like the sugar guys made millions of dollars. The 1946 strike, they're out for, I want to say 80 days, and they lost $15 million.
Wow.
And that's not 50 million modern dollars, that's 1940s dollars.
Yeah.
Multiple millionaires are made in Hilo, just off of the plantations out there. Like there's a lot of money to be made. If you can keep workers poor, you can keep workers powerless, you can make money off of sugar. So they did.
Yeah. I don't want to get into this because it'll take us in a different direction, but my first thought is like, why do these people who make so much money, like, why wouldn't their first thought be like, oh, we can help others? It seems like, let's just make everybody miserable and we can be even more rich.
Like, because that's, you don't go into a plantation, like just the fact that plantation has certain connotations. You don't start a plantation unless you're you're the type of person who's like, I'm about making that money. Also, a lot of them are controlled by shareholders. So they're like, well, if I don't make money for the shareholders, then I will lose my job. But part of it's the racism where you're like, well, this is good for a Japanese person. This is good for a Chinese person. Like, this is great for Filipinos. Of course I have an image of what life must have been like for them before. So this is wonderful. Like they get to be work for $22 a month in the 19 teens in a place that has a higher cost of living already than California at a rate that is less than anybody in California can make, even on the agricultural work there. So it's like, if I convince myself with enough racism and enough classism that people are glad to be this miserable, then I can justify taking home millions, literal millions.
So you talked about food. What other kind of things came out of the plantation days? Yeah.
So, language, Pidgin. Pidgin becomes the sort of everyday language for the vast majority. And it always had ethnic and class connotations. So like wealthy Hawaiians, went to Punahou, not going to speak Pidgin. A Hawaiian that works down at the docks is going to speak Pidgin. Even in the 1930s and 1940s, wealthy Chinese and Japanese merchants, etc., sometimes would not have those sort of Pidgin connotations. But everyone else working on the plantation, this is the language that everyone speaks. And it comes from, I don't know your words, you don't know my words, but we're working together and we can kind of if I point to something and I'm like, manapua, then it's like, yeah, okay, I'm gonna eat some manapua. And so it develops with a bunch of languages. The basic structure has a lot of Hawaiian in it, where adjectives go, etc. And then English sort of included in there. So there is that Pidgin, and that's something, it develops far enough that it stops being a Pidgin and becomes a Creole, and you got to ask the linguist what that means. But apparently it reaches a point where it's its own kind of thing. So language, and language is a marker. So even for like the, and this kind of experience of like being on the mainland and seeing someone local and then like dropping into Pidgin for a second just to be like, yeah. And it's that thing, like the 442nd guys talked about that being a distinction between them and the mainland Japanese guys of like, okay, this is how we mark that we're from Hawaii. So language, and then all that generation that went to the English standard schools but still grew up, like spoke Pidgin everywhere else but went to the English standard schools and end up with Hawaii business English, which is, if you listen to like that generation, there's like you are speaking proper English with a very clear Hawaiian or like Pidgin cadence. If you listen to Inouye, when Inouye is talking to a professional audience in Hawaii, that's what he's using. On the stump Pidgin in Congress, it kind of dies out, but you can still hear a little bit. You can hear a little bit where it's just like, oh yeah, like I can hear that like Hawaiian business English language. Aloha shirts, which start off as party shirts kind of thing, and then it sort of develops into like, this is my professional attire. I'm like, this is how I show that I am the teacher and you're the students. I'm going to show up in an aloha shirt every day. But that comes out of that era, and it's they just had a big exhibition at the Contemporary Museum. But they were talking about like, you know, it's incorporating fabrics from that were leftover fabrics because you couldn't use those little bits for kimono. But then there's also Chinese fabrics that were stuff, and like there's elements of like Filipino, the embroidered shirts. So like all these things coming together and becoming a recognized sort of, it starts off in the 1930s and 40s. It's just like, oh, these are like, the design is, it's a work shirt. It's like a palaka shirt. And then it becomes a party shirt, and then it becomes this other sort of marker of identity. So all of those things, like that era really shapes, because when you look at modern Hawaii, your main cultural influences, the main cultural sort of grounding points are going to be Native Hawaiian culture, right? Which is throughout all this plantation stuff, like Hawaiian culture is always a big chunk of it. And especially sort of development with like the working class Hawaiians, like that becomes like a big chunk of what becomes Hawaiian culture. So, I mean, part of like in the language, in the food, in pastimes like surfing, etc., like all that kind of stuff, like that becomes part of the local culture. The immigrant groups, the Asian immigrant groups, and the Portuguese, like a little bit of us too. Like there's no ukulele and there's no malasadas without Portuguese. So like right there, that's your... we could stop there and we're fine. But so like, you know, so the immigrant groups, and it's all that era, that basis for modern Hawaii, it's all sugar immigrants. Pineapple also, but it's the same guys. And then Americanization, which is where we get all the Star Wars and all this stuff. But like, so those three things kind of create it. So it's very hard to find parts of things that it would be local culture that you're not going to find a basis in Native Hawaiian stuff, that sort of immigrant plantation culture, or the two combined.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I feel like nowadays I didn't grow up knowing much about the plantation days or anything about that. You know, and hearing you talk about how pretty much everything that I know to be local culture kind of stems from that, it's kind of disappointing that I didn't, you know, learn that, you know. And I don't know if that nowadays this generation is learning that, but it's I just took it for granted and I just assumed like, oh, we all just wanted to talk and try things out. We all just made a little melting pot of people, and now this is local culture.
Yeah, no, it was much more tense than that.
Yeah.
But like, and like, there's definitely, you know, the amount of like all those things take generations, right? That creation of the thing, because that first generation did not trust each other, and there's ways they're kept apart from each other. There's like, you know, the Koreans and Japanese, there was some tension because Japan's an empire. For the Filipinos, like when they're brought in, there was explicit sort of attempt to be like, we are going to bring in the Filipinos and keep them like poor. And so they paid them, like, we're gonna pay you less than the Japanese. So there's huge fights between the Japanese and the Filipinos. And the 1920 strike seems to be broken largely because they struck in two different camps. They both struck at the same time. The union leaders are talking to each other, but the people aren't talking to each other. And so there's no solidarity, and they're able to convince the Filipinos that the Japanese are gonna sell them out. And they're able to convince the Japanese the Filipinos are gonna sell them out, and that's what breaks it. So you take that versus something like the 1946, which is the first time they get a big successful strike in Hawaii. The reason it's successful is because it's pan-ethnic. Because in the 1930s, they start organizing, down at the docks at first, but organizing everybody, not in ethnic unions, but like everybody's got to be in the same union. Because if you cut anyone out of the union, you've created scabs. And if you create scabs, then you lose. So you got to make sure that everybody's in there. There's some great stories. Like apparently they went 1946 during the strike. They're like, well, we're going to go get Filipinos from other parts of the Philippines, and we're going to bring them in, and they're not going to know about unions. And it's like, dude, there's a full-scale communist revolution going on in the Philippines. And so they bring people in being like, the Filipinos don't know, because the racism has made them believe this like image of like simple Filipinos. And a bunch of the ILWU guys on the boats, because a lot of sailors are ILWU, they got all the Filipino ILWU guys they could find, got them onto those boats. And so by the time those guys came over, they're coming off the ship with ILWU cards, and they've joined the union before they even get there. And like that kind of, you create solidarity, you can create these things. If you create some sort of sense of connection and ownership amongst a mass of people that have a natural enemy, like there's clearly someone going after all of us from above. You create that solidarity, you can create incredible things. You can create a political party based around a bunch of 20 and 30-year-olds, mostly. Like the Democratic Party was young people whose parents could not vote, who had no rights as citizens, that became, I mean, they do become the power structure, but at that moment, they overturn everything. When you look at culturally, like creating this new culture, it's because it's like all squished in together and creating this thing. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways that era sort of shapes everything we're in now.
You know, we're so lucky to have City Mill as a proud sponsor of Here in Hawaii, because, you know, they're a kama'aina company that for over 125 years, they've been dedicated to supporting the people and neighborhoods that make Hawaii so special. And the great thing about them is that they're so in line with what we're doing here at the show, because they believe that our people and stories are what make our islands unique. You know, City Mill has been our kama'aina hardware store, locally owned and operated since 1899, so they kind of know a thing or two about our islands. And you can visit any of their 8 convenient locations on Oahu, so you can find them all over the island. They're in Ewa Beach, Honolulu, Hawaii Kai, Kaimuki, Kaneohe, Mililani, Pearl City, and of course, Waianae. So if you need something, try check City Mill. Hey, I wanted to take a quick second to acknowledge and mahalo one of our great sponsors here on the show, and that's Aloha Care. They're a nonprofit health plan, and they've been a really great partner for us in supporting the show. So please support them by going to their website and learning more about them at alohacare.org. All right, now back to the show. What other ways did them coming together help give them this kind of advantage and power to make changes for themselves and give them more control?
The main one straight up is going to be the unions. Because agricultural labor was left out of a lot of the union reforms of the 1930s, the national union labor reforms, there was an expectation that Hawaii's laborers from these multiple ethnic groups, many non-citizens, all that kind of thing, wouldn't be able to create any sort of cohesion. And it's part of it is that when the ILWU comes in trying to organize the docks, they're like, we can't organize the docks because there's too much labor out there that is left out of unions completely. And that creates scabs. So if we do this, they're gonna bring in people from the plantation to break our strikes. So the ILWU explicitly set out to organize the plantations, and like at in Hilo, they organized like everything they could, just creating a massive movement that everybody's in solidarity with each other around organizing labor. Once they do that, then 1946, they're 15 million. I mean, what the union was asking for was not huge, and they easily could have paid all of that off and not for far less than 50 million. But they realized, the owners realized, if we agree to this, we've lost power. And the unions know that if they can get the bosses to agree that as a group, we have the right to negotiate with you, that they have power. So that's the main thing, was that solidarity on the economic front. And then the political front, the Democratic Party is and has always been a mishmash of different sort of interest groups. And it's successful in Hawaii largely because it's the one they're able to successfully push against, pull everybody together. And many of them, 20-something-year-olds who'd never been in politics, pull them together, organize enough to win in 1954. And that's just extending out what a union is into sort of politics. And there's a lot of mistakes that are made. They kind of should have won in 1952, but they couldn't get in 1950 and 1952. But there's a Will Rogers quote, something about, "I don't belong to an organized political party, I'm a Democrat." And that was true. They're unable to get their crap together. But they learn 54, they're able to dominate. And it's just, that era's Democratic Party is very much about bringing enough people in together to do this thing. And it's largely around this sort of solidarity around, one, being this early creation of a local culture, and two, the big five and the plantations and the oligarchs are going to eat us alive, just like they ate our parents alive, if we don't do this. The way they got the pan-ethnic solidarity was, first off, very, very simply, not creating an ethnic union. The old unions were a Japanese union, a Filipino union. The ILWU with Harry Kamoku, the docks were really Hawaiian. And the Hawaiians held down the docks. And that sets up a situation where if you want to break the Hawaiians want to negotiate for stuff, hey, look at these Japanese guys that work on the docks now, you created scabs. And so Harry Kamoku was an ILWU guy he was a sailor. And when he comes back, he's kind of we need to have that's the only way we're going to win. He helps organize the ILWU docks guys. And one of the first things they had to do was convince the Hawaiians and Portuguese that were getting dock jobs that you can't do this. You can't be cut the Japanese out. And then convince the Japanese that you can actually trust us. Once you get that first level and you make sure that there's leadership from all the different ethnic groups, right? So if it's we're creating a pan-ethnic union, but there's only a Japanese boss, the Filipino guys are gonna be I don't know about this. So you make sure that there's leadership at all these levels. ILWU institutional support is big because they bring the lawyers, all that kind of stuff from California. But a lot of it is going to be that making sure that people, and that generation is going to be more willing to trust each other because they grew up with each other. And they're still going to be I don't know about those Japanese. There's still going to be that. There's still going to be ethnic tensions, but it's just yeah, but way less than your parents' generation because they came from the Philippines, they came from Japan, and they were purposely manipulated to keep in tension. So part of it is just culturally, stuff is loosening up. If you look at the Massey case, that group is already a pan-ethnic group because that's Kalihi, they're from Kalihi, right? So you're already seeing that culturally, and then it's just a matter of making sure that institutionally you're doing the same thing. If you want to create a pan-ethnic union, you have to from the start say we're going to create. You can't be we're going to bring people into the Japanese union. We're going to bring people into. It's no, we're going to create a pan-ethnic union and then actually work towards it. Nothing happens unless you work towards it with a set idea. The actual things that came out of the 46 thing, it's always going to be three things. Those first strikes are always going to be conditions, and the conditions were poor. After every strike, conditions got better. Even if the strike got broken, they're well, we don't want another strike. So they're okay, we'll give you housing. You'll get unpaid maternity leave was one of the things. But 46 are like, we're going to strike for conditions to make sure that we get just better conditions on the plantation, better hours, et cetera, like actually paid overtime instead of just showing up and continuing to work until it's dark. Pay, like we would like to be paid better. And then close shop. So close shop is the right to not just, well, also they want to have, fourth thing, just recognition of the damn union. We want you to recognize that we exist to negotiate for the workers. And if you don't recognize that, we can't negotiate, right? So the recognition of the union, and then the other thing that comes along with it is a closed shop, that everybody who works there has to be part of the union. And a recognition of a closed shop. And that's a strong, like it is a strong arm tactic, but in those sort of situations, you only have strength because you can't hug the bosses and hope that they give you what you need. You have to have everybody together. And part of that is like, if everybody's together, we definitely can't cut out, like we can't say, oh, only the Japanese can join. Only the Filipinos can join the union because you want to close shop. So it's like, okay, everybody's got to come together. And when it comes to negotiation, our ethnicity is union. Off the plantation, where you're doing your stuff, whatever, but you have to create that from the start. And they got the recognition of the closed shop. They got conditions. You never get what you want. You never get what you ask, but you get what you're willing to take. And they're able to, again, cost them $15 million. They're going to be willing to give up a lot more when they've lost $50 million.
Yeah. How are they able to get around things like, I understand power as far as getting people together in politics, but as far as finances go, that's, I assume, was a huge hurdle for them.
Oh, yeah.
So how did they get around that?
So a lot of stuff, there is, I don't know if I'm going to there is, I can't remember if it's Japanese and Chinese, there is a history of pooling money that was already in existence, right? And so like when you look at the 1960s, like the hui in Hawaii, not like the hui, like big capital letters, but like the small hui that create a lot of the real estate deals that are in that land and power book, those small hui are small investors. Like we don't have a lot of money. We can't play in this real estate market, but we're gonna come together and we're all gonna cobble together this much and we will be able to afford to do this thing. And that is coming out of some of the older Chinese, and I think Chinese and Japanese sort of commoners being able to pull something like that together for agricultural business, agricultural needs, and then the same thing sort of going into this. Knowing you can't get a bank loan. That's the main thing.
Right.
Like First Hawaiian Bank at that period isn't going to be like, oh, you want to start a restaurant. They're going to be reluctant to be like, this is a business that often fails. You're a Japanese immigrant that has, very limited business capability and only your sweat equity. I can lend you money, or I can lend money to because I only have so much money to lend, I can lend it to somebody who's running a more conventional business that I know, and that'll probably work out better. So cobbling money together to be able to do that is going to be something like a group is able to do. We all chip in $100 at a year, probably much less than. And then like this year, the money goes to you, you get to go do something kind of thing. And so like there is a history of that, but finding ways for that generation, finding ways to institutionalize that, finding ways to actually make that into something that will work in a contemporary situation, those become limited partnerships. And like the early sort of move towards having community banking in that sort of way eventually ends up being community credit unions, which is built in from, there's already the infrastructure coming in from the US of this is how we've done this and this is how we recognize under federal law, turning those things into this new thing, and just finding ways around. And once you do that, then the banks are going to pay attention because they're like, oh, there is a market here that we are ignoring, and sort of it'll force them to loosen things up as well.
Wow. So it seems like for you, the key has always been solidarity and the power of that. Now, in your current position as teacher, to the next generation, what is it that you're trying to bridge to the next future leaders and next community leaders as far as these lessons?
So all my stuff is like the leaders are always bad. But no, but it's
Influencers.
Yeah, but it's the main thing is any sort of movement has to be around organization. It has to be about creating, like, solidarity didn't happen, it was made. Like, they purposely made that happen. That has to be something, and then it's always about the analysis of power is something that our society does not do. Like, we've gotten trained to at least we're like, oh, I see racism and I recognize it. But there's no like, okay, why is that racism happening? It's always just like, because racism. And it's like, no, racism is just a symptom of power imbalance, right? And it's a feature in American power imbalance. But like, okay, you look at it and then see why it works. So I think one of the main things is if you feel that you and the people around you are being screwed over by someone, you need to look for where who is benefiting, where is the power imbalance? Why is it, look at something like all the transphobia stuff, where it's like the amount of actual way that is in any way interacting with like how things work on a broad scale, very minimal, right? There's like most of the issues being raised by the sort of transphobic community, the transphobic faction, doesn't like it doesn't actually affect them.
Yeah.
Why are you getting this angry? Well, if you look at it, then it's like, well, this actually reinforces ideas around heteronormativity. It reinforces ideas around gender, and like there is a certain amount of misogyny that's very clear there, even when it's hidden under like we're trying to protect women. That's like, oh, look at the places where they went after they went after trans people. You're also usually going to find a lot of other stuff where they're like, oh, they're going after women, and that's the whole thing. Because then if you're going after women, you also set up a situation where you control men, because you, through homophobia and through these strict gender lines, it's like, well, you have to act in these ways or else you'll be a woman, and you've seen what's happened to the women. So always look at the power. If you see bad things happening and you don't ask where the power is and why that power is there, then you're never going to get anything done. Like maybe you'll switch who's in control, but you'll never actually dismantle that hierarchy of power.
So with all of your knowledge and experience of how things, where they came from, I think most people would then ask you, well then what's your opinion about the future and the state of our state of Hawaii? Like, do you feel optimistic, or are you like, I've seen this play out and we're headed in the wrong direction? Like, what is your personal?
It's always bad. My students by the end of the term are always like, just give us something positive.
Yeah.
I am a very negative person, but I look at it and it's like, I can see negatives, a lot of anxiety. This is my way of like dealing with it. It's like seeing all the negatives, being able to pick them out. I don't know. You gotta ask activists. Like honestly, like a lot of activists who are doing all of this stuff are the ones, because they're actually thinking and planning, they can see a hopeful future. I can see the past. I can see where the hope was in the past. I can see where the misery and the absolute oppression was. I can see the hope, and I can see where the hope fails. But also, there's a lot of cases where it's like, if you look at how things, the hotels right now are the new plantation, right? Largely large immigrant workforce, heavily exploited. The amount of racism that goes on, and just like how we're going to like negotiate with our workers and all of that kind of crap, still a billion times better than working on the plantations in the 1910s. They're still organizing, they're still pushing, the unions are still going forward. And that is hopeful to me, that it's like we have definitely gotten better, and those lessons that were learned in the past, absolutely, like they just got a deal, and like you can see those lessons still being used today. So there's hope there, and continuing those things. There's also hopelessness, because like the a lot of the people
just got you out of the
Yeah, I know.
You just want to go right back.
You can never relax. There's never going to be a moment where like everything's cool.
Yeah.
Because someone's going to be like, everything's cool, but here's a way I could get power.
Yeah.
And now maybe, you know, sometimes like I help dismantle the old thing. Now I'm going to be the new thing that helps dismantle you. So it's just this, there's never a moment of rest and relaxation. It's like, it's a constant thing. Power is always there. There's always a benefit to having power. You'll always have people using power to manipulate others. So that's as hopeful as I get.
That's kind of like whatever, I forget what the quote is, but from the movie about something like you work so hard to take down the enemy until you become the enemy or something like that. Like,
it's that.
Yeah.
And like you stare into the void long enough, you become the void or something.
Yeah. So safe to say, I think what I got from this lesson is that from the plantation era, the best benefit we got was awesome parties, because we got all our food for these parties and the attire for these parties. Celebrations wouldn't be the same in Hawaii if it wasn't for the plantation.
And pan-ethnic unions that were successfully able to get people enough time off and money that they could have a party.
Right.
Which is a big part. I should also say, like the plantation era, we kind of mourned the end of the plantations, but the plantations did suck. The plantations themselves, they suck. The culture that came out of it, it's like, it's this whole new thing. It's like, the plantations were awful. So anything good coming out of it is definitely a byproduct that they never expected. But yeah, excellent parties.